I hope that it doesn't. Okay. Welcome everyone to session 2 of Remembering Greatness. This session will be about Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who passed away last year. And I said in the beginning, I did a lot of learning as I researched this class myself, and I hope that you learned something as well. I'm curious what people know about Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz before we begin. We're going to start out with like a short biography, but throwing out some really quick associations. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who is he? What's his contribution to the Jewish people? Like off the top of your head.
The Talmud.
The Talmud. Okay, did he write the Talmud? Is that?
Basically.
Basically, he wrote the Talmud. Okay, one of his monumental work, which he also called his hobby, was producing a complete translation of the Talmud, which he started when he was 27 years old, and it took him 45 years to complete. 45 years. Okay, so I remember in yeshiva and in Migdal Oz, we'd always say like, if you were kind of using the Steinsaltz, you were cheating. Okay, I don't agree with that sentiment anymore, but thus Steinsaltz, his translation became synonymous with that edition that was helpful with elucidation that you could kind of use to help you figure out the text. And I don't think it's cheating anymore. So we can talk more about that as you explore your relationship with Talmud and learning as we go on. Okay, anything else that you associate with Steinsaltz? Anything else? I can go ahead with reading our bio. So there are many bios and tributes out there on the internet. The amount of people who want to commemorate him and talk about his influence are many, and they're very important people. It's really interesting to see the variety of people who acknowledge and felt the need to write about Rabbi Steinsaltz. So we'll talk about his life and accomplishments in brief, and this is a short one from the Accidental Talmudist blog. I just found it more clear and a good mix of the personal and the professional. So this is the biography. I'm reading on page 1. A rabbi for the ages, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. Rabbi Adin Even Yisrael Steinsaltz. Okay, he changed his name to Even Yisrael, a translation of Steinsaltz at some point. He was a Torah giant who published over 200 books, founded a network of yeshivas, dedicated his life to battling Jewish ignorance and apathy. Perhaps his greatest achievement was his monumental translation and elucidation of the entire Babylonian Talmud, a project that took him 45 years to complete, and he's been called a one in a millennia scholar. People compare him to Rashi, as someone who made the Talmud accessible to the everyday learner of Talmud. Born in Jerusalem in 1937, Rabbi Steinsaltz was a direct descendant of the first Slonimer Rebbe, a leader of the Hasidic dynasty. And we'll see in his thought as we go on the influence of Hasidism on his thought. It's really phenomenal to see this balance of Talmud scholar and deep Hasidic thinker in one human being, and even more so someone who produced so prolifically. And we'll see that. However, by the time of Rabbi Steinsaltz's birth, his family had abandoned all vestiges of Jewish observance, and his parents, Avraham and Leah, were fervent communists. Interestingly, although Avraham Steinsaltz was not a believer, he hired a tutor to teach his son Talmud. And he told young Adin, I want you to be an apikores. I want you to be a heretic, not an amat haaretz, not an ignoramus. So I want you to know what you don't believe in and push against it, right? Not just not know. Leah adamantly refused to light Shabbos candles. Always an iconoclast, young Adin rejected the Marxist ideology of his parents and became a Baal Tshuva, a returnee to Judaism as a teenager. On his own initiative, he enrolled himself in a religious high school where he learned from the great Rabbi Shmuel Elazar Halpern. He was greatly influenced by Chabad ideology and the teachings of the Kotzker Rebbe. The Chabad leader Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was driven to make authentic Judaism accessible to all Jews, and this became Steinsaltz's mission as well. He knew that the biggest enemy to Jewish continuity in our age is widespread Jewish ignorance and apathy. Steinsaltz's student, Rabbi Pinchas Alush, said he dedicated his life to making the entire canon of the Jewish library, the Bible, Mishnah, Talmud, Maimonides, Tanya, and more, accessible to each and all, regardless of their level of knowledge and background. Rabbi Steinsaltz wanted to democratize the Talmud his motto was "Let my people know." So that's what I put at the top of the lecture. It's called I think it's a great phrase. Let my people know. I love it as like an educator as well. It's just very compelling. Yeah, we'll see more of the things that inspired me as I learned about Rabbanit. Like his Rabbi, Steinsaltz was well educated in secular subjects and fully engaged in the world outside the religious community. While enrolled at Yeshivas Tomchei Tumimim, the central school of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, Steinsaltz was also studying math, physics, and chemistry at Hebrew University. At age 24, Rabbi Steinsaltz became Israel's youngest school principal. So in an interview with Rabbi Steinsaltz, one of the concepts that we're going to explore is how he talks about the God being infinite and our encounter with the infinite. And he compares, how do you understand the infinite? And he talks about some sort of mathematician's theorem that I had to Google, and I didn't quote here because I didn't want to sound kind of silly, but he's a mathematician as well, and that's what he would even incorporate that into his theology. A very well-rounded individual. So in 1965, when Rabbi Steinsaltz, and I can send you the name of the theorem if you're interested. In 1965, when Rabbi Steinsaltz was 27, he founded the Israel Institute for Talmudic Publications and began a project of staggering ambition, a translation and commentary of the entire Talmud, which hadn't been completed for centuries, right? Not since Rashi tried to do a line-by-line commentary, or did a line-by-line commentary. He worked 16 hours a day while also teaching, lecturing around the world, and writing hundreds of articles and dozens of books. Steinsaltz worked on his edition of the Talmud for 45 years before completing it in 2010 when he was 73. The Steinsaltz Talmud editions include translation from the original Aramaic into modern Hebrew, English, and Russian. And the completion of the project was celebrated with a Global Day of Jewish Learning, which has become an annual event, which we will also celebrate at our shul once again this year. Okay. Influenced by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Steinsaltz became active in outreach to Jews trapped behind the Iron Curtain. He opened a yeshiva in Moscow in 1989, the first officially sanctioned Jewish school in Russia for 60 years. He founded a network of yeshivas in Israel and the former Soviet Union. The chief rabbi of Russia, Adolf Shayevich, gave Rabbi Steinsaltz the title, I don't know how to say that word. I don't know if anyone here does. But the spiritual rabbi, an honorific indicating that his importance to Russian Jews. Throughout the 90s, Rabbi Steinsaltz traveled to the former USSR every month from his home in Jerusalem. He founded the Jewish University in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Rabbi Steinsaltz published the 13 Petaled Rose, his classic work of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, in 1980. He also completed a 9-volume on the classic book of Hasidic philosophy, the Tanya. He published 60 books, wrote thousands of articles, ranging on philosophy, theology, prayer, morality, Kabbalah. In 2014, he also published a biography of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay, so a beloved figure, just to finish it off, among all segments of Israeli society, Rabbi Steinsaltz was awarded the nation's top civilian honor, the Israel Prize, in 1988, right? And he lived for a bit after that, still active. For decades, he gave evening seminars, which attracted Israel's most prominent political and cultural figures to lectures that lasted until 2 a.m. or later. Rabbi Steinsaltz had a stroke in 2016 and lost his ability to speak. His mind was still sharp, and for the next 4 years, he continued to edit his previous work with the help of his son, Meni, with whom he communicated silently. Okay, mind-blowing what this one man achieved in his life, his dedication to, oh, thank you, Benny, for the shout out to the Global Day. His dedication to Jewish literacy and education, like unending motivation, it seems. The rabbi wrote in his little blurb on Facebook that I would address the question of what motivated Rabbi Steinsaltz to translate the Talmud. It's interesting, he doesn't talk about it in many of his interviews. And I brought a few quotes about what he thinks about the Talmud to kind of maybe get at that. But it's like he doesn't talk about his work as if it's something big that he's doing. He's just dedicated to the Jewish people, dedicated to making Torah accessible to everyone. And that's what he worked at. It's just phenomenal. In tonight's class, so there's I just wanted to put a little blurb. In tonight's class, we're going to explore some core teachings of Rabbi Steinsaltz as summarized in a class by his student Arthur Kurzweil. He's a writer who served as Rabbi Steinsaltz's driver when he was in New York, and he wrote 2 books about him. So he actually wrote a book about his conversations that he had after he volunteered to be Rabbi Steinsaltz's driver. Apparently, he heard of Rabbi Steinsaltz and he called his assistant and said, "What can I do to be a part of his project? How do I help him? I'll do anything." So his assistant said back to him, well, like, what skills do you have to contribute? He said, well, I can drive him to the airport. And he said, great. And then Arthur Kurzweil became his driver, Rabbi Steinsaltz's driver. And he has a site dedicated to his teachings. And we're going to explore different excerpts from essays and books of Rabbi Steinsaltz as compiled by his student. And his student, Arthur Kurzweil, summarizes Rabbi Steinsaltz's mission as follows. Kurzweil said, "The Talmud was never meant to be an elitist book. It was meant to be for everybody. So Rabbi Steinsaltz spent 45 years trying and succeeding to make that happen." Rabbi Adin Eben Israel Steinsaltz died on August 7th, 2020. He's survived by his wife, Sarah, 3 children, 10 grandchildren, and is buried on Jerusalem's Mount of Olives. Just a pull quote that I took to summarize who he was. My idea is that I'm trying to substitute a book for a living teacher, right? That's what his project of translating the Talmud was for him, which it has been, right? A living teacher for so many. I'm going to pause. Any reflections, thoughts, things you want to add to Rabbi Steinsaltz's biography summary of his life? Anyone here meet him? Me neither. Yeah, it would have been an honor.
I met him very briefly at the Jerusalem book sale once, and I bought a book from like the Koran stand, one of his books from like the Koran table, and had him sign it. And he seemed like so disinterested in being there, though. He was like, I could be like learning Torah right now. And it's just like, so he like scribbled in my book. And it might also, I think it was before he had the stroke, but he was just like, it's like
he had stuff to do.
Yeah, he had like Torah to write. Like, he's like, what am I doing here signing books for these people? Why did these Koran people drag me out to this, whatever? Yeah.
Yeah. So there are like many like different masim that are quoted of, I interacted with Rabbi Steinsaltz this one time, and this is what I learned, that kind of lore about him. There is an interesting, I was exploring some of the interviews or things that people had said. And apparently he spoke at a high school once. And he addressed the crowd, and he said, he told the students, make a lot of trouble for your teachers, right? When you're learning Talmud, that's what you need to do. So then the principal of the school got up and said, well, I don't think he actually meant that. It's so inspiring to have him speak to us. Thank you so much. And he went back to the podium and said, I meant what I said. Make trouble for your teachers. That's how you learn. That's how you know you're engaging in Talmud. We're going to see some of that also coming up in what he thought about learning Talmud, but how the act of, and it's Chaval, I couldn't find exactly the quote that Arthur Kurzweil was talking about when he talks about Talmud, but talks about Talmud as creating problems, opening questions and not answering them, analyzing things until there's nothing left, and not arriving at answers, whereas prayer is about entering into an act of faith and not questioning. So that was Talmud study for him, right? Ask all the questions and don't stop. That's how you know you're engaging in the right way. So many stories out there about him, but 15 teachings, and some of the 15 teachings from the 13 Petaled Rose, the book. They're not all quoted in the 13 Petaled Rose. I pulled from a lot of different places, but Arthur Kurzweil said they're all in the 15 Petaled Rose. I remember, so my connection to Rabbi Steinsaltz was beyond learning from his Talmud, is that my dad is something into Kabbalah, right? He likes to study Kabbalah and Chassidut, and I found this book in our house, the 13 Petaled Rose, one day in our library, and I think I must have been in high school, and I read it, and I remember it feeling like I finally understood something, like he was telling some sort of truth that I hadn't heard before, but was so intuitive, and explained things about my relationship to God, opened up avenues in my relationship to God in the day-to-day in a way that I hadn't encountered before. This was before I had ever studied Chassidut or Kabbalah in any way. I've revisited it, not often enough, but it's a beautiful work. And it's kind of work that you kind of meditate over, and then we'll also take specific ideas out and talk about them. But I encourage you all to investigate it, to find it, and find a copy, check it out. So this first teaching comes from the introduction to the 13 Petaled Rose, which is a image from Kabbalah, the 13 Petaled Rose. So the first truth, the first teaching of Rabbi Steinsaltz is that we already know the truth of Kabbalah. We already know in our bones, in our being, the truths that are contained in Kabbalah. So when you encounter them, right, it's kind of like uncovering something you already know deep within you. Sorry, Linda, you had written that Avi spent Pesach at his yeshiva in Moscow. Wow, when he was in high school, and Maury met and spent time with him in Jerusalem. That's really cool. So I'd be curious to hear any stories they had of him, or if they shared of him. Maybe you can share towards the end or something if you remember anything. Fascinating. Okay, so anything that you come upon in the Kabbalah is the theology of Judaism according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, and all that's contained in there is already something that's very intuitive to us. So here's what he writes in the introduction to the 13 Petaled Rose. He writes, "This little book is a book for the soul. It begins quite deliberately, and perhaps to the dismay of some readers, with a view of another reality. It does not proceed from this world or from the familiar ways of man in our society. Instead, it seeks to go from the genuine center of all being to the world and to human life." So from God outward, right? The truth of the universe outward. There's no attempt here to speak about Judaism, to prove its worth, or to justify it, rather to let the message communicate itself. And if a person permits his soul to listen, the soul will soon learn that all it needs to do is remember, because in some dim, enigmatic way, it already knows all this. Okay. If you're an analytic thinker, you might say, prove it to me. Like I said, the experience of reading this book kind of felt this way when I first encountered it. It's like you're reading through kind of truths that make sense, which you can't really argue with rationally necessarily. So I don't know if anyone here has experience with learning Hasidic text. That's what it seems most akin to, of something trying to plumb the depths of human experience and the truth of human experience, and just appealing to personal experience and emotional realities of someone's own life, and kind of saying, this is the truth of the world. I don't mean that in any way to diminish it. I mean it in like a deep way, right? That he's a mystical thinker, and he thinks that, alignment with if you read this, it's kind of just in line with the universe, just like we're all in line with, human nature. That's what it is. Okay. Number 2, we are a soul that has a body. Okay, the nature of our existence in the world is that, right, is our soul, and the soul has existed before us and will continue to exist after us. And this body is kind of a vessel that carries the soul around and allows it to exist in the world. That was a core teaching, and here's a few texts on that. Of course, feel free to chime in if you have reactions, thoughts, comments. So he writes, and this is also from the 13 Petaled Rose. The soul of man functions through its instrument or vessel, which is the body. Through it and with it, the soul thinks, perceives, feels, and acts. Through it and by it, the soul has to fulfill its double function in reality. Okay, so here he appeals to he speaks about what he thinks our mission is in the world. First, it has to perform a certain task in the process of perfecting the outer world. So we have to influence the world around us, or at least that part of the world to which it is destined. The place we're born, the people we interact with, We need to affect our outer worlds. And second, its task is to raise itself, right? So there's the internal work and the external work of the soul. But these tasks are not necessarily separate. They are accomplished simultaneously. Okay, and he speaks more about the soul and this belief in reincarnation. And he teaches a soul that returns to the world through reincarnation does not necessarily return with the same self as before. The self is not a function of the soul alone. It depends on the connection between the soul and the body, between both of these and the environment, as well as the time and place in which that soul is living. All of these factors create a self that is different from the original one, despite the fact that it's the very same soul as before. The entrance of the reincarnated soul into the new body, therefore, means a new beginning and a new life experience for it. So our soul is eternal, and yet we are unique. We are ourselves are unique and have come into one form of being that has never existed before and won't exist again. So I kind of love that balance of the eternal, and also we're very uniquely us. The soul that has fulfilled its task, that has done what it has to do in terms of creating or repairing its own part of the world and realizing its own essence, can wait after death for the perfection of the world as a whole. So if we accomplish our personal task first in the world, that's okay. And then we wait for complete redemption. It's a part of the full redemption, but doesn't depend on it. But not all souls are so privileged. Many stray for one reason or another. Sometimes a person does not do all the proper things, and sometimes he misuses forces and spoils his portion and the portion of others. And in such cases, the soul does not complete its mission, its task, and may even itself be damaged by contact with the world. It has not managed to complete that portion of reality, which only this particular soul can complete. And therefore, after the death of the body, the soul returns and is reincarnated in the body of another person, and again must try and complete what it failed to correct or what it injured in the past. Okay, so the reason for reincarnation is that we came to this world and we tried, we didn't fully complete the task, so we come back. Or we caused damage and we need to do repair. Again, I find that, maybe it's a false dichotomy, but I've always kind of struggled with this balance between rationality, or like the analytical study of text, and the spirituality of Judaism. And this is a figure who, just as a whole being, combined the two, and it's not at odds with each other. He translated the entire Talmud and is speaking about reincarnation and the soul's task in the world. And he's going to speak more about our relationship with God and how our soul interacts with the world. Okay. Then there's some kind of Zen stuff that I'm curious. Right, as he was a worldly person that was educated in general matters as well, I'm curious, like what thinkers he encountered. I don't know exactly who influenced his method of understanding spirituality, or his way of putting together theology. But he talks about non-understanding, right, and that is a bedrock of our belief, right? It's important to acknowledge that much of what's in this book, he means the 13 Petaled Rose, which lays out the theology of Judaism according to him, right? Kabbalah as the roadmap to understanding the world. But much of what's in this book is beyond our understanding. He wrote it, but he may not understand it. Okay, I don't know how to uncouple that paradox, but okay. In acknowledging that it's impossible to understand, we have the key to begin understanding. So once we're able to say, I don't know, that's when we can be open to actually understanding the world more. It's kind of, it reminded me of that I don't know who it's attributed to, but right, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, saying, I don't know if, okay, religious studies major over here, okay, but if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, that's a saying that's, I don't know who it's attributed to, but you do.
Probably not the Buddha.
Yeah, no, obviously it probably was not the Buddha. But what it means is to say, like, if you think you found enlightenment, you think you understand the master's teachings, you think, right, lahavdil, right? But it's in a similar way. If you think you understand the truth of the world, that's the moment you know that you really don't get it. right? Because you kind of close yourself off. You're like, I'm done learning. I'm done. I've got it. That's when you know you've like lost your humility. You've lost your openness. You've lost one of the keys to basically being open to being in tune with God, to being in tune with the world as it is right now, because you've become stuck in one place. You think you've found the Buddha, you think you've found the truth, or you understand Kabbalah. That's the point at which you know you failed and you start over or refresh. Okay. Number 4, God did not create the world, past tense, but God is constantly creating the world and continuously sustaining the world. Right, this speaks to an intensely personal relationship of God with you and me and all of us and the entire world at this very moment. It obviously is reminiscent of the what we say in Tefillah, that God renews creation in His goodness every single day. But what it means is more than that, and this is found in other Hasidic teachings as well. Is that it's the idea that if God, right, it's almost like God is thinking the world, right? Or God is, God has God's mind, as if to say God has a mind, right? God has God's mind on the world. And if God were to remove God's attention from the world or stop maintaining us, stop sustaining us, for 1 second, we would cease to exist. So God is actively creating it and sustaining the world in its current form, in this very moment, moment to moment. And if God ever ceased to do that, we would cease to exist. And so an intensely personal relationship with God. So here's a few writings on that. This is from the Trials of Life in his essay, The Candle of God. Creation happens anew every day. And this idea that creation happens anew is also an opening for us. That's what it in Hasidic thought, it would mean that, right, every single moment you're a new creation, right? If you ever think that you're stuck in your ways and you have no way back, or if you've wanted to fix and you erred, right? It's impossible, right? That was the old you, because that was you of a second ago, like literally. And there's always a chance to repair. There's always a chance to start new, because you are being created right now. And if God didn't want you to be created anew, God could not think you, God could not sustain you, and yet God is in this moment, and you have this new chance, this new possibility, this new opportunity, and this fresh start every single moment, right? It doesn't need to be Rosh Hashanah, it doesn't need to be the new year, it's any single moment. Okay. So creation happens anew every day, from nothing to the fullness of which is, just as it occurred at the beginning, so that it's not a single action, nor is it a continuous evolutionary process. It is an ongoing renewal of creation each day and all the time. That is to say, at every point in time, there's a new creation of the world, like the heartbeat of life. If the pulsation should cease for any reason, all life comes to an end. In this sense, there's an oscillation of the creation of the world. At every moment in time, it's renewed. There's no existence without the creative force that continues to fashion all that has come out of nothing. God wants us as we are right now and is continuously renewing us and sustaining us. Number 5. And this was Arthur Kurzweil's wording, so I'll elucidate a little bit. He says, God is not the CEO of the universe. And that means to say, God is not at the top of the food chain and kind of only consumed with, well, what are my top employees doing? What is what's the boss at this company doing and the boss at that company doing, or the highest managers doing, and not paying attention to the secretary who works, Tuesday nights and whatever, right? God is not the CEO. There's no order of operations and only relating to the higher ups in the system. God is infinite. And so is just as close, right, to the smallest beings on earth as God is to the more complex beings. So that's the idea of the infinite, right? We can't understand the idea of infinitude, but if we could, right, that God has the power to be able to be in close relationship and in close, right, sustains even the tiniest being and cares in equal measure about every being in the world. And that's in the next teaching, number 6. To God, everything is of the same proportion. Right? I'm not more important than the ant that crawls under my feet. And here's the teaching. Precisely because the divine is apprehended as an infinite, not finite force, everything in the cosmos, whether small or large, is only a small part of the pattern. So there's no difference in weight or gravity between any one part and another. The movement of a man's finger is just as important or unimportant as the most terrible catastrophe. For as against the infinite, both are of the same dimension. Just as the infinite can be defined as unlimited in the sense of being beyond everything, so it can be defined as being close to and touching everything. Sorry, that was a quote that was copy pasted. Yeah, so that's to emphasize the importance of every single person and every single being, and also our smallness. Right, right. I am nothing but dust and ashes, and the world was created to me, holding both of those things because God is infinite. Right, we can't understand that God would care in equal proportion about every single thing. And that's because we can't comprehend that God is infinite. Right, does not have limitations like we would imagine. Any reactions so far? Thoughts? Comments, anything that's resonating, things that you've heard before, things that are surprising, things that seem in line with your theology or against your personal theology? Mitch? Nope, that was a mistake. Okay, anyone?
So I'll just say briefly on this last one, infinity is dangerous because as the quote here shows, at a large enough scale, nothing matters.
Right. So he's using both things, right? He's saying at a large enough scale, nothing matters, which means have humility. And you don't understand God's infinitude, right? In a way that we can't understand, God is also actively close to all of us and cares about all of us, right? All of these have flip sides. I think, and there could be the like problematics with all of these. And yeah, well, Benny, I saw some nodding. You found something problematic?
Well, a lot of these I think you pulled because they're paradoxical in nature, right? It's
okay. You're darshaning my intention. I don't know what you mean.
Well, I think you pulled some of these because they sound very interesting because it's two parts of the same quote that seem to be getting in different directions. Juxtaposing them that way is challenging. And as you said, the man in general had this juxtaposition of being Kabbalistic and into all this stuff, but also being analytical and understanding that side of things.
Yeah.
There's something really empowering about it too. That's like, I am nothing and God really cares about me. You know, that despite the fact that I am nothing, God really cares about me. So like my nothingness isn't that significant, you know, the fact that it's nothing is still like God cares about even nothing, right? So like I'm still amazing, you know.
Yeah.
Something very, very like sort of like old school Hasidish about it. Like it's very sort of like Rav Eli Melech or Rabbi Nachman or like all those like that kind of like era of Hasidut about it. It's very like rooted in sort of like
and then right, the two notes in your pockets goes back much earlier than that, right? So
yeah. But sort of it's like rooted in this sort of like humanity is frail, but life is also important and human beings are important.
Yeah. Okay. Descent for the sake of ascension. Okay, if you've studied Chassidut, you've heard this concept before, and it's something called Yirida L'Tzorech Aliyah, which means I put myself in a lower situation, or I even sin in some understandings of this concept in order to elevate myself further. Okay, that's also paradoxical, right? What does it mean? I'm putting what would it mean to actually transgress in order to elevate myself? So his text here, the text that I pulled here, doesn't exactly embody that as it comes to play in other versions of this idea, but we'll see something on Yirida L'Tzorech Aliyah and the thought of Rabbi Steinsaltz. So this is also from the 13 Petaled Rose. And he writes, the process of the soul's connection with the body, called the descent of the soul into matter, is from a certain perspective the soul's profound tragedy. But the soul undertakes this terrible risk as a part of the need to descend in order to make the desired ascent to hitherto unknown heights. So even coming into this world is a descent, right? Taking on human form is taking on risk, is taking on a chance that you're going to sin, because obviously you can't sin if you're not in this world. And we're doing that yirida, that descent, in order to achieve, or to have the chance to achieve the potential of the aliyah, of being in this world, of the ascension that can come through actually interacting with the world, doing mitzvot, being physically involved with the world around us. It's a risk and a danger, because the soul's connection with the body and its contact with the material world, where it is the only factor that is free, unbounded by the determinism of physical law and able to choose and move freely, make it possible for the soul to fall, and in falling to destroy the world. Okay, right? The potential for sin happens only when we inhabit the body, or when our soul inhabits a body. And yet, indeed, creation itself and the creation of man is precisely such a risk, a descent for the sake of ascension, right? And that's the nature of the world, of creation, is that God created the risk in order for there to be a payoff, right? Yerida l'torach aliyah. I don't know how much further this line of thinking plays out in other writings of his, and then, like I said, in other Hasidic thinkers, Yerida l'torach aliyah actually has to do with doing things that would appear to be transgressions, or putting oneself in a situation of a temptation in order to have that aliyah, that ascension. Doesn't seem to be exactly what he's talking about here, and I'd be curious to see if that appears elsewhere in that form. Okay. And on faith. So different questions and forms of faith, each in their own time, and there's like appropriate timing and dosage is the way that Arthur Kurzweil frames it for different traits and for different modes of thinking. Right there, I'll just let him speak for himself. Okay. From simple words by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz. Belief in God can be naive and childish, or sophisticated and elaborate. The images we have of God may be nonsensical or well constructed philosophically, and yet the essence of this belief, when stripped of verbiage and frills, is simple. Existence makes some sense. Sometimes one may think, probably mistakenly, that one knows exactly what that sense is, while others may just ponder it. In any case, there's a firm belief which precedes any kind of thought, rational and irrational, that there is some sense in things. What we experience through our senses or inwardly are only disjointed pieces. The fact that we somehow connect these particles of information stems from our a priori faith that there is a connection, and because it precedes reason. Accepting this assumption is the first, most fundamental leap of faith. So, right, we have this faith that there must be a connection between our experiences, or what we think, or different times when we have experiences of faith, that we can connect to each other. And that's not an experience, it's not something that we actually can say as a wholehearted, I believe, but we have this a priori belief that there must be some sense to the way that the world works as we experience it. Of course, people would not call this religious belief, nor see it as a point of faith. Nevertheless, when analyzed properly, it becomes frightfully close to believing in God. And this belief is like our belief in the existence of the world. It's the foundation of our relation to everything, indeed, on some levels, perhaps even more fundamental. This deep native belief can be found whenever we undo our childhood training and eliminate everything we were taught about belief as children, right? That we're accepting, right? As children, we have a more naive belief, and then there's this more disjointed belief that we have to come to embrace as we get older. And here he introduces the different elements of doubt or questioning, existential questioning, that needs to come into play later on in our journey, or in our maturation as believers. So then we must answer the question, what is God? Not on a philosophical level that claims objective definitions, but as an attempt at least to understand, what is God for me? To do this, we have to get rid of our preconceived learned structures and images which blur our real belief. We must delve very deeply into ourselves, into our most primal mode of thinking, indeed to begin at the beginning. Again, that theme of starting again, and in this moment I'm different than I was before. and going into ourselves, shedding ourselves of the naive belief perhaps that we took on as children or were educated to believe in as children, and to ask those questions, these existential questions. What is God? What is life about? Who am I? We're going to come to that in a second. So that's in number, maybe I'll skip to number 10, but okay. Actually, let's just begin at number 9. Despair is an essential part of tshuva. And when you ask yourself those existential questions, like, what am I? Who am I? Where am I going? Those questions, as we come upon them, is the voice of God speaking through us. Okay, so there's the despair that we experience, and then we come to ask these questions: what am I? Who am I? And that's the voice of God. Again, we see that it comes only, right? God comes through us, and we're in touch with God when we're in that place of unknowing, of uncertainty, and opening ourselves to possibility, and not actually understanding. So, and I love how he pairs it with, right? It's not going to be found outside of us, right? This belief is not going to be found outside of us. God is not going to be found outside of us. It's by delving deeper into who we are that we find God. So he writes, in the search for oneself, this question about where I am in the world is outwardly one that a person can ask of himself, but inwardly it's the voice of God speaking to man who has lost his way. And the moment a person reaches this awareness, he can grasp something which, with all the pain of the question, with all the fearful terror and awe of an encounter with God, leads to that which is larger and more glorious. Right? So this vulnerability of entering into that space of unknowing, of saying, I actually don't know, maybe I don't have faith, maybe I'm lost, is what actually opens us up to this encounter with God, this closer encounter with God, and a greater understanding. For the question of where I am, the question of a man who confronts himself alone, even if he is within a family, a community, a nation, even if he feels at home in the world, this utterly solitary question is fundamentally resolved at the moment when a person realizes that it is the other side of the question God asks of man. Where are you? Right? The Ayeka question that God asks in Breshit, right? Where are you? This then is the response to despair, to the unanswered plea of the bereaved and bewildered, to the lost son who cannot find a home, right? It's when we're lost and we're willing to reach out, God says, oh, where are you, right? God reaches out a hand and reaches for us. And it's the other voice asking the very same question, right? So it becomes mutual. Okay, a few more. Okay, if you think, and they seem to be, I mean, maybe I've combined them together in a way, but okay. If you think you've arrived, you're lost. Again, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. From On Faith and Martyrdom, and so this is a different work of his, The Long Shorter Way, which I haven't personally read. God being infinite cannot be grasped by the mind, and whatever is grasped by the mind is certainly not God. Okay. And there's an anecdote, which, however crude, expresses an aspect of this idea. When the Rebbe of Kotsk was asked to explain why God did this or that, he answered in his own blunt fashion, a God whom any thinking human can understand is not worth worshiping. I wonder what that translates to, and what language did the Rebbe of Kotsk speak? I don't know. Okay, in other words, if reason is satisfied concerning the divine, it has not attained anything consequential. Nevertheless, there's a higher hidden grasping of the divine, which is given to every person to understand, even the unlearned. This is an expression expressed in a faith that is itself enlightenment. Okay, and we're going to come to this next, right? About faith, right? Investigation, like the analytics of Talmud being juxtaposed to faith, and faith being that simple belief. In Proverbs, we find the simple man believes everything, but the prudent man understands. Faith is thus not a matter of simply believing, but that special quality which goes beyond the mind, which is of wisdom. That is to say, it's an experience directly connected to the divine. Okay. Therefore, the fact that a person is unlearned or even lacking in intellectual capacity makes no difference. One's faith is not nourished by the mind, but by wisdom of the soul, so that faith is available to all men, irrespective of their mental abilities, right? The man who translated the Talmud, right? Doesn't matter how much you learn, it's not connected to that. Okay. All right. He also talks about how you define who you are in relationship to God as your primary relationship, and not all the other relationships that obviously fill a person's world, that everything should be seen through the lens of your relationship with God. The Jewish attitude that life in all its aspects in totality must somehow or another be bound up with holiness, with God, with that experience of God. Through brachot, right, we express our awareness of God. The core of blessed art thou, O Lord, Baruch atah Hashem, is the essence of the blessing, its underlying message. The point of the blessing is to declare of a certain relationship to God. We say it's I, thou, he talks about in relation, like he quotes Buber. All the rest is details relating to a specific situation. The whole point of a bracha is to say, I'm in relationship with you, God, in this moment, and everything I do that requires a bracha. Okay. The sin of knowing is knowing more than you need to know. Okay. Number 14, God creates everything, even evil. Okay, so this is obviously very problematic. Tackling the problem of evil in the world is difficult theologically, but Rabbi Steinsaltz said that God sustains everything, even evil. And this is from the Sustaining Utterance as well. There's a truth that we are always in a situation of confession, whether it's the Day of Atonement or the midnight prayer of the Kriyat Shema. And we ask God to erase our sins, not by pain and suffering, but by forgiveness and mercy. And it does not always work out. We are not always given what we ask for, at least not in the manner in which, or time in which we want it. But actually, all that happens, the good and the evil, are aspects of God's manifestation. Except that our recognition is limited to those moments when we know that it's so. At such times, the situation is altogether different. One can relate differently. Not that there is less pain and suffering, it's merely that there's not the feeling of concealment. So long as God is not altogether absent, we can accept that it happens to us. Okay, interesting when we can accept that the evil is from God or not. But evil is being part of God. I wonder, I personally struggle with this theologically, and I wonder how he integrates this, or how he lived with this when he experienced difficulty or evil, or something deeper, some pain. That's what he talks about, is this whole holistic aspect, right? Everything is part of God. That which appears now to be evil will be reintegrated into holiness, he talks about, right? It's just that we're lacking in the larger perspective. We don't have the larger perspective, and that's why we don't understand it. Okay, and I wanted to conclude with this piece, which is about the oscillation between doubt and faith, which he talks about going from study, from analyzing text and Torah and questioning, pushing against everything we know in order to get further, and davening, praying. So there's the Talmud and there's the Siddur. And I couldn't find this exact quote, but this is what Arthur Kurzweil quotes. He says that it's the way of holiness is going between doubt and questioning, going between study and prayer. I pulled some quotes on study for you, but I wanted to just end on this text where he talks about prayer education and prayer as the ultimate expression of faith. Like, we understand what it means to push against things in the Talmud and to keep questioning and asking and problematizing. But we may not understand perhaps how prayer is the ultimate expression. Or maybe that's my bias. Okay. So from prayer education, prayer is an expression of faith. Once, when I was in the middle of my prayers, my little daughter tried to talk to me, and when I failed to respond, she was very angry with me. She said, "Why don't you speak to me?" Later on, I answered her by saying, "I was busy. I was speaking with God." And she then replied with great understanding that she hadn't noticed that God was answering me. The second question was very deep. A 4 or 5-year-old girl was prepared to accept the notion that I speak with God when I pray, but she wanted this to be a two-way conversation and not just a speech on my part. The point is that every prayer boils down in the final analysis to a very basic point. I say the words, "Blessed art thou," and especially the thou, which we saw previously, if I feel the presence of the thou before me. If I have someone with whom to speak, I can pray. If I have no one with whom to speak, then what's the point of all these words, all the things that I say? What I'm saying here is so simple that it should not need to be said, except that it still does need to be said and stressed. Prayer is an expression of faith. It's impossible to pray except out of faith in the encounter with God, in the standing of the I opposite the thou. And it's not a simple question of Buberian philosophy. It's a simple point, so simple that any child can understand it. And he goes further than this. He talks about God, being with God in relationship, and this faithful relationship of speaking with God as not only through the Siddur, not strictly as going to shul 3 times a day. And he writes the art of prayer. Okay, in the art of preparation for prayer. And this is our last text. Okay, and it's our ongoing relationship to prayer in every version of ourselves that we inhabit from moment to moment. So he writes, when I come to a prayer or a blessing and I don't find any affinity with it, I can still say it. But to have any emotion or deep involvement, there comes a wrestling with it. I'm trying to see, how much do I feel it? In prayer, one thing is important, the point of personal involvement. I can study, and that's a matter of intelligence, so I can say I understand a prayer text better. But when it comes to involvement, it's a matter of personal connection. Sometimes my wrestling is not with the meaning of the words, but where do I stand vis-a-vis the text? So I have to find inside myself those things I can have a connection with. Yesterday, I was basically aligned with the text, but today I don't feel it. I just find this like very raw and very relatable to my prayer experience as well. People are very changeable. Every day we're different. So prayer becomes very different on a daily basis, or even 3 times a day. Because of the changes in me, those things that sometimes in the morning make sense or are an expression of what I feel need to be revived, or they may not connect in the afternoon. And that's wrestling with prayer. If I'm not open in the moment I pray, I'm just repeating words. It's the same if you have a phone conversation with someone you love and finish by saying, I love you. If it's the girl you're engaged to, the I love you may be a strong emotion. 20 years into a relationship, it carries a different impact. My prayers reflect and express what I feel if I'm aware of what I'm saying. Sometimes I may not even be sure I should say the words of the prayer because it's not how I personally feel. And I love that he said, like a Gadol saying, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say those words because I'm not connecting to it. If you are praying, prayer is not just an exercise in pronouncing words. It's an intellectual and emotional connection. I'm not living in an ivory tower. I notice that for many people who do their daily prayers, they have an obligation, and so they say the words. And I want to tell people these things can be done formally, but if you identify internally with at least a quarter of what you say in prayer, you'll be a different person. And he's saying, of course, right, you can continue to do the performance of the mitzvah of prayer, but try to do that work of actually feeling and assessing, where was I this morning with the Amidah, or with this specific bracha in the Amidah, and where am I this afternoon? What words are resonating now that weren't before, and why? What's happened? What's changed? And how? What's working? What's not? And that changes you, and it's meant to change you. Okay, that's everything that I brought for you. It's obviously just a tip of the iceberg of the legacy of Rabbi Steinsaltz. If you had anything more to add, or that you'd want to explore, again, ideas that resonated with you, I'm curious to hear. Sorry, I didn't attend to the chat. This is all originally written in Hebrew. That was 20 minutes ago, so sorry. Yeah, I'm curious if this leads you to any further exploration, or however this meets you. Obviously happy to keep on discussing and learning. Thank you all for joining, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.